So first of all, thanks so much for the invitation to speak. And the first question that I would like to discuss in this lecture is basically this. We all know that deep learning is doing really amazing things. And today, using modern neural networks, we can solve highly complex computational problems that most people thought were impossible to solve 5 years ago or so. And today, we can pretty much solve those problems on our laptops. But at the same time, there is another system in the universe that is equally amazing and perhaps is even more amazing. And that system is human brain. And the first question that I would like to discuss in this lecture is whether or not these two kinds of amazing things, one that is happening in the world of biological neural networks and the other one is happening in the world of artificial neural networks, have anything in common with each other computationally. And I'd like to start by highlighting a couple of similarities between biological neural networks and artificial neural networks. The first and the most obvious similarity is the so-called architectural similarity. And what it means is the following, that if we look, for example, at the organization of a deep convolutional neural network, it is organized as a sequence of layers, so that each layer is composed of individual neurons, and every individual neuron is doing some kind of very simple kind of computation. But when you put all of those neurons together, the whole system is doing some very impressive computational thing. And the same thing happens in biological neural networks if you, for example, look at the organization of the visual cortex. So that's the architectural similarity. Another kind of similarity that I want to briefly highlight is the so-called representational similarity. And what it means is the following. Again, if we focus on, say, convolutional neural networks, and we look at the receptive fields of the weights of the first layer of hidden neurons in the convolutional neural networks, you can visualize them, and you can see images that look like these guys. And the funny thing about these images that they look very similar to the receptive fields or weights of the so-called orientation selective cells, the famous orientation selective cells that were discovered in the set of experiments by Hubel and Weisel in the 60s. So what these people did is the following. They took an anesthetized cat, and they put the cat in front of the screen, and they put a little electrode in the visual cortex of the cat. And they projected on the screen bars with various kinds of orientation. And what they discovered is that for pretty much every orientation of the bar on the screen, there is a group of cells in the visual cortex that become active, that start to fire. And the receptive fields of those cells are very similar to the receptive fields of the hidden neurons in the first hidden layer of the standard convolutional neural nets that are trained on standard image data sets. So these are the similarities. But at the same time, deep learning is a kind of very loaded term. And it includes both the idea that neural networks have to be deep and should be composed of individual neurons, but it also includes another idea, that those neural networks have to be trained in certain ways. And currently, if we kind of look across all the spectrum of literature in deep learning, I would say that perhaps in 90% of cases, those neural networks are trained using certain procedure, which is called end-to-end training using the backpropagation algorithm. And the main question that I'd like to discuss in today's lecture is the following. Whether or not the second half of deep learning, the way how we train deep neural nets, has anything to do with the kind of computation that is believed to happen in biological neural networks. So let me explain what the problem with backprop is. Let's remind ourselves how we typically train a standard feed-forward neural network. Consider, for example, a neural network that is shown here on the left portion of this slide. So this neural network has a layer of visible neurons VIs that is followed by the layer of hidden neurons HMU, then another hidden layer HA, and the layer of output neurons. And let's imagine that we are trying to learn this matrix that projects from the visible layer into the first hidden layer. So typically, in order to find this matrix, what we do is we define a loss function that penalizes the discrepancy between the outputs and the targets. And then we take the derivatives of that loss function with respect to the weight, and we incrementally update the weight in proportion to that derivative. Now, what is interesting is if you carefully calculate the expression that appears on the right-hand side here in these curly brackets, you will see that this expression is highly non-local in the activities of neurons. And what I mean by that is the following, that in order to learn the weight that connects the neuron number mu and the neuron number I, using this bracket, we would have to know not only the activities of those two neurons, but we would also have to know the activities of all the neurons in the layer above. In this specific case, this will be the neurons HA. And we would also have to know the activities of the output neurons and the targets. So in that sense, the information about the states of those specific neurons has to be somehow non-locally propagated to the synapse between the cell number mu and cell number I. So that's an example of a non-local learning rule. Now, in biology, the story is entirely different. In biology, we have a presynaptic cell I and a postsynaptic cell mu, and there is a synapse WMI in between those two cells. And if we are trying to learn the strength of that synapse, we are allowed to use any complicated procedure, but that procedure should be local. So in mathematical terms, what this means is that in order to learn the synapse WMI between those two cells, we can apply some arbitrary complicated function f, but that function should have only two arguments: the information that is directly available to the cell number mu and the information that is available to the cell number I, and nothing else. And when I say the words information here, information can be anything. It could be as simple as the activity of that cell, or time derivative of the activity, or any other local function. So that's the first difference between how we typically train biological neural networks and how we think about training artificial neural networks in deep learning. Deep learning algorithm is non-local, and biological algorithm is believed to be local. Now, the second problem with backpropagation training arises from the fact that now, if we look again across all the literature on deep learning, I would say that perhaps in 50% of cases, the neural networks are trained on the so-called supervised task. So the input to the neural net is some images or some other kind of data, and the outputs would be the labels or the classes of images. And borrowing this metaphor from Christian Grauman, the way how we train these neural networks looks a little bit as if we were trying to teach babies using flashcards. So when we are trying to teach this neural net, basically we prepare a bunch of flashcards with images of cats, and then a bunch of flashcards with images of dogs. Then we shuffle those flashcards around, and then we give it to the neural net. And we say cat, cat, dog, cat, cat, and so on. And we hope that by doing so many, many times, the neural network will pick up a concept of a cat and a dog. And maybe it's possible to train babies this way, but hopefully most people in this room, and in fact most cognitive psychologists who study children development, believe that that's not how early children learning works. So babies are exposed to a rich visual stimulus, to a rich visual world, but the majority of that visual experience is believed to be unsupervised. And that's another big difference compared to deep learning. Now, the main question, or if you wish, the main idea that I'd like to discuss in this lecture is the following. What if we take these two requirements as fundamental? The idea that the learning has to be unsupervised, and the idea that the learning algorithm has to be local. If we constrain ourselves to those rules of the game, is it possible to somehow engineer a learning algorithm that would lead to a good generalization performance on some standard machine learning benchmarks? So that's the question. And on the next few slides, I'd like to present to you some algorithm that accomplishes this goal in some nice way on some very simple tasks in machine learning. So let me explain what this algorithm does. Imagine that we are trying to train a neural network that is very simple, that looks like this one. So there is a layer of visible neurons, VIs, followed by the layer of hiddens, H mu. And there is a matrix of projections, W mu I, in between. And there is nothing else. There are no labels, there is no higher layers. We are only trying to train this neural network. So typically in deep learning, when we do this, when we deal with this kind of networks, what we do is we take the data, VI, we multiply the data by some matrix, WMI, and then we pass the result through some nonlinearity. So here I'm going to do something a little bit more complicated than that. So I'm going to present the data to the neural network, but in order to calculate the activities of the hidden neurons, I'm going to solve the differential equation that you can see at the top portion of this slide. So let's try to understand this differential equation. The letter H mu here stands for the activity of the hidden neuron number mu. DDT is time derivative, and the constant tau is some positive constant that defines the overall time scale of this dynamical process. On the right-hand side of this equation, you can see the sum of three terms. The first term, I mu, is the input current, and the input current is given by the dot product between the matrix W and the data. The last term in this equation, minus H mu, is the standard relaxation term. And pretty much, if we forget about the second term that I'll explain in a moment, the steady-state solution of this differential equation would be given by H mu equals I mu, right, in the long time limit. And that's kind of the standard deep learning regime in the case when the activation function is linear. But now we have this second term. And what the second term does, it introduces competition between the hidden units. So when we present the data to the neural network, all the hidden units want to get activated. But if some hidden units become stronger activated than others, those strongly activated hidden units will suppress the activations of the units that are activated slightly less. And that's what this term does. So basically, what I'm doing here, I'm introducing some inhibitory connections between the hidden neurons. And by doing that, my neural network, strictly speaking, stops being feed-forward because there are lateral connections in the hidden layer. And mathematically, what this term does is the following. So mu is the external index. It's the index that refers to the hidden unit that we're trying to update. And the sum here goes over all the hidden neurons that are not equal to mu. And the R of h is some activation here, function here, which is simply a rectified linear unit. And the parameter double inhibition is some hyperparameter of the algorithm that is some positive constant. So the typical solution of this equation looks like the one shown in this panel. So let's take some data. For example, think about the data as MNIST images. We take the MNIST images, we use the dot product to convert the images into a set of input currents, and then we solve numerically this differential equation. And what we see is the time traces that look like these ones. So some hidden units like H3, it starts from 0, and then it rises and it fixes at some large value. Some other hidden units like H1 and H5, they start from 0, they rise initially, but then they fall and they fix at a smaller final values. But most of the hidden units like H2 and H4, they drop below 0. And that's kind of the typical behavior of this of the solution of this differential equation. Now, once the system reaches that final steady state, what we're going to do, we're going to read out the activities of those hidden units, and we're going to use them for learning, the learning of the matrix WMI. And the idea that is used for this kind of learning mechanism is inspired by the old idea due to Donald Hebb, and it's called Hebbian learning. And, in the standard Hebbian learning, what we do is in order to update the synapse WMI between the two cells, we take the activity of the presynaptic cell VI and we multiply it by the activity of the postsynaptic cell H mu. Here, I'm going to do slightly more complicated procedure. Instead of simply multiplying by the activity of the postsynaptic cell, I'm going to multiply it by the activity by some function of the activity of the postsynaptic cell. And this function should be nonlinear, and the shape of this function is sketched in the right portion of this slide. So let's try to understand this function. This function has a point h star, where the output of this function changes from negative values to positive values. So the region above h star corresponds to so-called Hebbian learning, and the region below h star corresponds to anti-Hebbian learning. So in the Hebbian learning regime, the hidden units are pushed towards the data. And in the anti-Hebbian learning regime, the hidden units are pushed away from the data. That's kind of the basic intuition. And pretty much what we're doing here, we present data. We can present data in mini batches or online, and we wait for the system to equilibrate, and then we apply this learning rule to adjust the weights. And we keep doing this many, many times. Now, in reality, the update rule is a little bit more complicated than I have just explained on the previous slide. And it is given by this differential equation. So again, on the left-hand side, you can see the time derivative of the weights and some different time learning constant tau. Tau learning is a longer time scale, because learning happens on a slower time scale. So tau learning has to be bigger than tau in this equation. And on the right-hand side of this equation, the first term is the Hebbian learning term that I have just explained on the previous slide. And the second term here, it's a specially engineered term that ensures that the synaptic weights WMI, they do not grow to become too big. Because in biology, there is all kinds of homeostatic constraint that the synapses cannot become too strong. And that's why we introduced this second term that ensures that the synapses are somewhat limited in size. And the nice feature about this term, that kind of the way this whole equation is engineered, it is engineered in such a way to ensure that the fixed point of the dynamics in the long time limit satisfies this constraint, so that the weights connecting one hidden unit with all the visible units eventually converge on the surface of a unit sphere. And this kind of organization of the weights to the surface of the unit sphere happens dynamically. And that's a nice feature to have. OK, so let me try to apply this algorithm to something very simple. And as we heard in the previous talk, there is a very nice data set, CIFAR10. So let's play with it. So what I'm going to show you here is some simple illustration of how this algorithm learns the receptive fields of different hidden units. So we initialize hidden units at random. And then I'm going to start the algorithm. And as you can see, eventually the algorithm picks up certain aspects of the CIFAR10 images. And the longer we run it, the more kind of refined and diversified those aspects are. And I'd like to emphasize here that this algorithm does not use any labels from CIFAR10 dataset. So it only looks at the raw images, and it's trying to kind of find a good representation of those images. So that's the idea. So it's very different from what you do in conventional deep neural networks. OK, but so far, I have only explained how to train this simple neural network with one hidden layer. Now imagine that we have done that. Now what we can do is we can freeze that matrix W1. We can map the data into the latent representation. And we can apply the same algorithm again to train another matrix W2 on top of W1 by simply applying exactly the same rule. And that's what we do here. And you can do this for as many steps as you like. But eventually, once you train all those layers that are stacked on top of each other, you would like to use this neural network for some practically useful task. And the way how we do this is the following. Now we introduce a little bit of labels into the problem. So we throw in some labeled examples. And we are training the top matrix that is shown here in the red color by the letter S, that stands for supervised. And we train that matrix using standard stochastic gradient descent. And you might wonder, I was explaining you, for such a long time that stochastic gradient descent or backprop is biologically unrealistic, and now I want to use it for some part of my algorithm. Now, it turns out that backpropagation or stochastic gradient descent results in a non-local learning rule if you propagate through at least one hidden layer. But if you don't do that, if you only train the top classifier without propagating through hidden layers, that backpropagation or stochastic gradient descent learning rule can be written as a perfectly plausible local learning rule. So in principle, this whole procedure complies with the rules of the game that I outlined at the beginning, and it's entirely local procedure. OK, so that's the idea. And once we train that neural network, we can, of course, evaluate it on different kinds of tasks. And let me show you how it works. So let me start with something extremely simple, such as MNIST. Here, I'm going to compare the performance of two networks. One that is trained in a biologically plausible way according to the algorithm that I have just described. Another one, the network of exactly the same size and exactly the same architecture, but trained end-to-end using backpropagation. And here you can see the weights that come out of the biologically plausible algorithm. Here you can see the weights that come out of the end-to-end training. And here you can see the performances of those two neural networks. So let's first of all take a look at this panel. So on the x-axis here, you can see the training time. And the training time here refers to the supervised phase of the training of the top classifier. And the magenta curve and the green curve here correspond to the network that is trained end-to-end. So that's a standard deep neural network. And you can see pretty much what you expect to see on MNIST. So the error on the training set quickly drops to 0 and then stays near 0. The error on the test set quickly drops to some small value, 1.5%, and stays there. And 1.5% is pretty much the best that you can do on the pixel permutation invariant MNIST if you are not using dropout or adversarial training, if you are only using stochastic gradient descent. So it's very hard to do better than that. Now, if we now focus on the biological neural network, it does something entirely different. So the error on the training set for the biological neural network is shown by the blue curve. And you see that it never really reaches 0. So it reaches some small number, about 0.4%, but it's not 0. So it never really fits the training data perfectly. The most surprising aspect of this plot is that the error on the test set for the biological neural network reaches pretty much the same plateau as the error on the test set for the network that is trained end-to-end. And that's interesting. That's interesting for two reasons. The reason number one is that this biological neural network, it had to comply with the locality rules, right? So it had to only use local learning rules, which made its life more complicated than the network that is trained end-to-end. That's one problem. And the second problem, that when we were learning the weights of the first layer, that neural network had no idea about the task that it will have to solve eventually, right? Because we didn't tell you whether or not it's going to do a classification, or maybe it has to distinguish odd digits from even digits, or maybe do something completely different. Yet it found some nice set of weights that ended up being useful for this classification task. And that's kind of interesting also. OK, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but I'd like to briefly mention that, in principle, there is a large number of efforts in the literature to make various kinds of approaches to deep learning more biologically plausible. And the idea is to design some kind of approximation to backpropagation that would satisfy the locality requirement. And I don't have time to talk about all the details about those works, but they exist, and you can see some of the references here. And you can also see some of the reported benchmarks for the same task, the accuracy on the pixel permutation invariant MNIST. OK, so next data set, CIFAR-10. Same kind of comparison. Here you can see the network that is trained in this biologically plausible way. Here you can see the network that is trained end-to-end, and here you can see the performances of the two. Without going too much into detail, you can see pretty much the same effect, that the performance of the network that is trained in a biologically plausible way is almost the same as the performance of the network that is trained end-to-end. And the weights, there is a little bit of gap there. But the weights that come out of the biologically plausible trained network and the network that is trained end-to-end look entirely different. OK, so I don't think I have too much time to explain this in detail, but I want to mention very briefly that, in principle, the first part of the algorithm, the unsupervised phase of the algorithm, has many hyperparameters. And some of these hyperparameters are shown here along the x and y axis. So for my illustration, I used the Euclidean L2 norm for the weights. And I showed that kind of the learning algorithm is designed in such a way so that the weights converge to a Euclidean sphere. But in principle, you can generalize it to Lebesgue sphere with arbitrary p norm. And it turns out that this generalization has some interesting computational consequences. And on the x-axis, you can see the strength of anti-Hebbian learning. That was denoted by the parameter delta in one of the previous slides. And what you can see in this plot is a kind of a phase diagram that shows the weights that come out of the unsupervised training algorithm for different combinations of this parameter delta and of the Lebesgue norm p. And you can see that the weights that live in this corner of this phase diagram look entirely different compared to the weights that live in this corner. So they just visually look completely different. And in spite of that, both weights end up being quite useful for the task that the network does eventually. OK, I think I'm going to stop here. And I'd like to conclude by saying two things. So first of all, one interesting aspect about these sets of ideas is that the biologically plausible algorithm, it has to satisfy the constraint of locality. And in spite of that constraint, the performance of that algorithm on the classification task is almost as good as the performance of the network that is trained end-to-end. And the second conclusion is that the network that is trained in a biologically plausible way is entirely agnostic about the task that it will have to solve eventually in higher layers. And in spite of that, it also finds a very nice set of weights that end up being quite useful. And I also should say that these ideas are pretty new. And so far, we have only rigorously benchmarked them on very simple tasks like MNIST and CIFAR, and only in the context of very simple, fully connected nets with one hidden layer. So in principle, more work is required to fully investigate these ideas. And the very last thing that I want to say is that this work is done in collaboration with John Hopfield from Princeton Neuroscience Institute, and we have a preprint that is available online if you guys are interested in more technical details of this work. And I also put together a Jupyter notebook in this GitHub repository, and I try to kind of to make it very simple, but at the same time educational. So if you guys are interested in playing around with this kind of algorithm and play with different hyperparameters and modify them in various ways, you're welcome to try. Thanks.
So we have some time for questions.
There's been a paper recently by Sebastian Jung about Hebbian learning. I haven't read it yet, but I just wondered if there is a connection between your work and...
Well, I probably haven't read it either because it's recent, right? But so yeah, in principle, Hebbian learning has been around for a while, and Sebastian is like one of the people who consistently wrote many important papers on this subject. So presumably there is some connection, but I would have to read the paper to see what that connection is.
Thank you very much for this very nice talk. I was going to ask about one of the desiderata that you had at the beginning, which is to be able to train with few supervised examples. We didn't see from the results that was achieved. Is that correct? You still had to wait for a long time?
Yeah. So in the examples that I showed, you throw the entire, pretty much labeled data set that you have. And I share intuition with you that, it should be possible to train the classifier with fewer labeled examples because, you already have a nice set of weights. So there's something that we should definitely try. We haven't done this, unfortunately. Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the computational complexity, the mathematical computational complexity of this algorithm is equal to the computational complexity of the forward path in backprop. So it's much faster than training, network end-to-end by propagating derivatives. Now, when it comes to practical implementation, initially we wrote a simple code, and that code was running for a very long time. And then we had to do a lot of work to make it run fast. But I would say that, say, on CIFAR 10, to see these kind of simulations that you see here, for the network with 2,000 hidden units, it takes about 0.3 seconds per epoch. So it runs, incredibly fast compared to what you would normally do in TensorFlow on CIFAR using supervised training. Yeah, so 0.3 seconds per epoch is kind of what we have at the moment, with the mini batch size of 1,000 images.
Since it starts with kind of an unsupervised approach, does that mean it is more robust against adversarial?
Yeah, great question. I think it should mean that. We have not investigated that in detail. But so if you look at, if you look at the weights that come out of this biological training, they look less speckled than the weights that come out of the end-to-end training. And so here, strictly speaking, those weights are obtained without using regularizers. You can impose various kind of regularizers and make those weights more sparse. It's possible to do that, but they would still be highly speckled. And kind of the origin of adversarial perturbation is in the speckleness of the decision boundaries. So my intuition that indeed this algorithm should be much more robust against adversarial perturbations, but this hasn't been, rigorously demonstrated yet.
So for the application function H, when I said it goes from -1, then the sharp increase to +1. And in my basic understanding of neural network is limited, I understand that it's good to have an application function that's continuously the function. Is there a reason why you chose that application function?
Yeah.
A more smoother?
Right. So first of all, you can choose a more smooth one. It doesn't really matter. So we chose this one for simplicity. But the more important aspect of your question is that the reason why people prefer smoothly differentiable activation functions because they want to differentiate them, right? When you do end-to-end training, when you backpropagate derivatives, taking derivatives of the function becomes extremely important. Here, we're not doing backpropagation. We're not backpropagation derivatives at all. So for us, it absolutely doesn't matter whether or not the activation function is differentiable or not. You can design, arbitrary activation function that you like, and, it's not going to be a problem.
So in your algorithm, you have a layer structure of the network. I don't know exactly how the brain works, but I would imagine something more like a graph with some inputs and outputs, which does not have this tree structure. Have you thought about that? Are there any models that do that?
Yeah, great question. So again, kind of, deep learning in some sense has some inspiration from neurobiology, right? And kind of, when you hear about deep learning in online courses, that inspiration is very well narrated. Now I'm kind of saying that, there is some problem with that inspiration, right? So there are some aspects of deep learning that are not biologically motivated. Now, kind of, if you look at the connectomics of the visual cortex, there is pretty much every connection that you can imagine. So there is a ton of feed-forward connection. There is a ton of lateral connection. There is a ton of feedback connections. And pretty much, I think it's fair to say that there is no good understanding within the neuroscience community what those connections are used for. So kind of what we're trying to do here, we're trying to kind of take one piece of inspiration one by one and try to see what it's doing computationally. So I completely agree with you that it's very likely that those feedback connections are very important in the visual cortex, and there are many aspects of the visual cortex that are not yet in this algorithm. But that's kind of the work for the future. So the novelty here is that we at least utilize the lateral connections, the connections that exist within the layers. And already that, it's kind of something new compared to standard convolutional neural nets or ResNets that most people are playing with in deep learning. But I agree with you that in principle there are many other aspects of neuroscience that are not yet part of this algorithm. And that's, I think, is very exciting area for research in general, because probably those connections and those aspects of visual cortex or any other brain area, those kind of complicated graphs, they're used for something. We just don't know what for.
That's all. Thank you.